Grease smells like memory if you stand over it long enough. Byrex smells like a kitchen that no longer exists. At 3:14 in the morning, Odie Marsh was frying both at once when four men walked into Sal's all night, and one of them put a gun on the counter like he was setting down his keys. Nobody in the diner moved. The regular at the end of the counter, a bus driver named Curtis, who came in every night for 2 eggs and dry wheat toast, went the color of the toast. The register girl, Priya, had her hand halfway to the phone under the counter and stopped there, frozen, like the air itself had told her not to. The tallest of the four men, the one with rain still beaded on the shoulders of a black coat that cost more than Odie made in 2 months, wasn't even looking at the gun. He was looking at her spatula, at her hands, at the small pot on the back burner where she'd been keeping warm, for herself, for her break, a spoonful of spinach and feta wrapped in phyllo, the way her foster mother used to make it, and murmuring the old words over it, the way Fatimja used to murmur them. Not a prayer exactly, just a habit, just noise a woman makes to keep her hands steady at 4 in the morning. She wasn't even aware she'd been saying them out loud. He was. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. It wasn't shock. It was 30 years falling through a floor. What she said next, and the word she used for him, the old word, the one his mother used to call him when he was 6 and skinned his knee, and not the men in this city who called him by the wrong one, would be the reason 4 men who'd walked in already knowing how the next 10 minutes were supposed to end, left instead, in a silence none of them could explain to their boss. But that part comes later. First, understand what an aching body sounds like at 3 p.m., which was where Odie's day actually started, 9 hours before any of that. The apartment on Van Buren smelled like a landlord's cigar, and the mildew he refused to acknowledge existed behind the bathroom tile. Odie Marsh, 34 years old, stood in her kitchenette in a bra and the black polyester pants she'd worn to 3 different jobs over 6 years, and counted the bills on the counter for the 4th time that week. $340. That was the gap. Not the whole rent. She had most of the rent. $340 was the distance between having a home on the 1st of August and not having one. Her feet already ached, and her shift hadn't started. That was new. That was this year. 12 years on a line does that to the arches, the physical therapist she couldn't afford had told her once, for free, in a conversation at a bus stop that she still thought about. The dog, a 14-year-old beagle mix named Ref, watched her from the one good chair with the patience of an animal who'd learned that begging didn't move dollar amounts. Ref needed $420 of dental surgery. Ref was not going to get $420 of dental surgery. Ref was going to get baby aspirin crushed into wet food and a woman who apologized to him every night like it was a scheduled mass. The bag of dog food on the counter was the wrong one, the store brand, instead of the one with the picture of the healthy Labrador on it, because the right one was $4 more, and $4 was a bus fare, or half a load of laundry, or the difference between an egg and no egg at breakfast. Ref ate it anyway, because Ref had learned the same lesson Odie had, which was that you eat what's put in front of you, and you don't make a production out of the parts that are missing. Her own dinner most nights was a box of the cheap red wine from the bodega on the corner, the kind that came with a plastic spout instead of a cork, poured into a coffee mug because she'd stopped buying wine glasses the year she stopped believing she'd have people over to use them. She allowed herself 1 mug, never 2. 2 was a door she'd watched other people walk through and not come back from, and she had exactly enough self-respect left, some nights, to keep her hand off that particular handle. Twice a week, she picked up a second shift at a laundromat on Bergen Street, folding other people's clothes for cash, paid under a folding table, a job that existed in the specific economic shadow where nobody asked for a social security number and nobody offered benefits either. Her hands, by the end of a laundromat shift stacked onto a diner shift, shook faintly at rest, a small, persistent tremor she'd started attributing to caffeine because the alternative explanation was one she didn't have the bandwidth to examine. Costas, the landlord, caught her on the stairwell that same week, blocking the narrow space with his body, in the particular way men do when they want a conversation to feel involuntary. "The first," he said. "I don't do the thing where we talk about it after." "I know what the first is, Costas. Then you know what I'm saying. He smelled like the cigar he smoked in the boiler room, where tenants weren't supposed to go, and like the specific mildew of a building whose owner spent nothing on the parts nobody could see. 340 short last month. I let it go because your dog was sick. I don't let it go twice. He's still sick. Everybody's still something, Costas said, and went down the stairs whistling. A man for whom other people's arithmetic was simply weather he didn't have to dress for. She stood on the landing a long moment after he'd gone, the tremor in her hands a little worse than it had been a minute earlier, and told herself, the way she told herself most things lately, that she'd figure it out, because figuring it out was the only load-bearing wall left in the whole structure of her life, and she couldn't afford for it to crack. She put on the collared shirt that said Sal's all night, in yellow thread that had started to unravel at the S. She put her hair back with a rubber band because the actual hair ties were gone, lost somewhere in the apartment, the way small things get lost in small spaces. She ate a hard-boiled egg standing at the sink because sitting down felt like giving up 20 minutes she needed elsewhere. The walk to the bus was 4 blocks. Newark in July smelled like tar going soft and the particular sweetness of a dumpster 3 days from pickup. The 34 bus was 11 minutes late. It was always 11 minutes late. She had stopped being angry about the 11 minutes the same year she'd stopped being angry about a lot of things, filed it under weather, under things a person simply dresses for. At the diner, her manager, a heavy-set man named Gary, who owned the franchise rights to 3 locations and drove a car newer than anything he paid his staff to stand near, looked through her the way he looked through the coat rack. "Friar 2's acting up again," he said, not to her exactly, more in her direction. "I told you that Tuesday." "Well, tell it again," Gary said, and walked into the office to make a call about something that wasn't the friar. She told the friar again. The friar did not listen either. 51 miles east, in an office above a shipping company on the Newark waterfront that didn't legally exist as an office, a different clock was running. The room smelled like cedar polish and the acetone edge of a solvent someone had used, badly, to try to clean blood off a floor 2 years ago and never fully managed. Agron Nikaj stood at the head of a folding table with his coat still on, though it wasn't cold, because taking it off in front of the men in that room was a kind of permission he didn't hand out. 11:42, 18 minutes. That was the number Dritan Kara had given him on the phone 40 minutes earlier, in a voice quieter than a man in Dritan's position needed to use, which was exactly why it terrified people more than shouting did. 18 minutes to find out which of the 6 men standing around that table had told a rival crew, the Bardi people out of Elizabeth, the exact schedule of a shipment that had cost Dritan $400,000 and, more importantly to Dritan, $400,000 of face. 6 men, 1 traitor, 18 minutes. The math wasn't complicated. It was cold. Somebody in this room, Agron said, and he said it quietly, the way he said everything, had a phone call on Tuesday night. I don't care who it was to. I care that it happened. Nobody answered. A man near the window, young, maybe 26, had a bead of sweat travel the length of his jaw and drop onto his collar, and everyone in the room watched it fall like it was the only interesting thing happening, because looking at Agron directly for too long had a cost nobody wanted to pay first. Agron didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Men who'd worked with him for a decade had never once heard him raise his voice, and that was the whole of his reputation, built brick by brick out of the absence of noise. A man who screams is a man who's still negotiating with himself. Agron had stopped negotiating with himself a long time ago. "I'll ask once more," he said. "Then I stop asking." Nobody in that room breathed the way a person breathes when they're not thinking about breathing. Dritan Kara smelled like a hospital before he ever entered a room. Antiseptic and starch, the smell of a man who'd once spent 4 months in a ward after a shooting nobody talked about anymore and had worn cologne to cover the memory of it ever since. He came in at 11:51, 11 minutes before Agron's deadline expired, without knocking, because Dritan didn't knock on doors in buildings he owned. He didn't ask who the traitor was. He asked Agron a different question, the one that actually mattered. "Do you know yet?" Not yet. $400,000, Dritton said, conversationally, the way another man might mention the weather, is not the number that worries me. The number that worries me is how the Bardhis knew a schedule that existed on 3 phones, all of them mine. That number doesn't have a dollar sign on it. That number is how many people in this room I can trust tomorrow morning, and right now the honest answer is, I don't know, and I hate not knowing more than I hate being poor. He looked at his watch. He looked at Agron. You have until noon, he said, not because I'm impatient, because the Bardhis will call by then, wanting to know if we noticed, and I would very much like to already have an answer prepared before they ask the question. Then he left the way he'd come in, without a raised voice, without a threat spoken plainly enough to repeat to a lawyer, and the room exhaled exactly as much as it had to, no more, because 6 men had learned a long time ago that relief shown too visibly in front of Dritton Kara was its own kind of confession. Agron looked at his watch. 11:53, 7 minutes. He didn't find his answer in that room, not that day. It would take him 3 more weeks, a diner, and a woman with flour on her wrists to find it, though nobody in that folding table office, least of all Agron, had any way of knowing that yet. Back at Sal's, the night crawled the way graveyard shifts crawl, in a long flat line interrupted by nothing, and then everything. 9:50 p.m., a trucker asked for the meatloaf special after 10, which they didn't do, and Odie gave it to him anyway, because arguing cost more calories than it saved. 11:15. Priya came back from her break smelling like a vape pen and complaining about a boyfriend neither of them would remember the name of in a year. Midnight brought the drunk crowd, 3 separate tables of them, loud and harmless, tipping in crumpled singles that Odie flattened against the counter edge before she put them in her apron. By 2 a.m. the diner had gone the particular kind of quiet that late shift workers learn to be suspicious of. Just Curtis at the counter with his eggs. Just the hum of the walk-in. Just the radio turned low enough that it was more a texture than a sound. Odie wiped down the same 6 feet of counter 3 separate times, not because it needed it, but because a body that's been moving for 8 hours doesn't know how to stand still without inventing a reason to keep moving. Her feet had gone past aching into the specific numbness that she'd learned, over 12 years, to treat as a kind of mercy rather than a warning. Gary had left for the night at 1:30, off to whatever life he had outside 3 diners that ran on other people's exhaustion, and the kitchen belonged, for these few hours, entirely to her and to Priya and to the low hum of machines nobody had switched off since 1994. She thought, standing over the little pot, about the notice that would probably be taped to her door in the morning, about the $4 between the 2 bags of dog food, about a physical therapist at a bus stop who'd told her, for free, that her arches wouldn't hold up past 40 if she kept standing on concrete the way she stood on it, and about how none of that mattered right now, at 3 a.m., with a pot of spinach and feta going warm on the back burner, and Fatimja's voice, borrowed and worn soft at the edges, coming out of her own mouth without her permission. That was when the Byrek came out, because 2 a.m. was Odie's unofficial break, and the Byrek was the one thing she made for herself and nobody else. Wrapped tight, corners folded the exact way Fatimja Krasniki had taught her at age 9 in a kitchen 4 blocks from this one, back when Fatimja was still alive and still swearing at a radio in a language that had no business surviving a Newark apartment building and did anyway. Fatimja had been Odie's foster mother for 6 years, from 9 to 15, one placement in a childhood that had cycled through worse ones, and the only placement that had ever given her something she still carried. The language, the proverbs, the particular way of folding dough with your thumb instead of your whole hand. Odie stood over the small pot, murmuring the words Fatimja used to murmur. Not prayer, not quite. The way you hum along to a song whose lyrics you've stopped consciously translating. At 3:14, the door chimed and 4 men came into the diner, smelling like rain and, underneath the rain, like cordite that hadn't been near a gun in a few hours, but had been close enough to leave its ghost on fabric. The tallest of them set a gun on the counter the way you'd set down a phone. Not aimed, just present. A fact in the room. "We're looking for a man," he said to Gary, who had come out of the office at the worst possible moment and gone the color of a paper napkin. Older guy. Comes in around this time. We were told he comes in around this time. Nobody in the diner knew which man he meant, or if they did, they weren't going to be the one to say so. Curtis at the counter had stopped chewing. Priya's hand had frozen 4 inches from the phone. And Odie, at the stove, kept stirring and kept murmuring the old words, because 12 years on a line teaches a body to keep working through things that would stop other bodies cold, and because some quiet animal part of her understood that stillness right now was the only currency she had. The tall man's eyes went past Gary, past the register, past the gun he himself had just put down. They landed on her. His mouth opened first. That was the strange part, the part that would replay in Agron Nikaj's head for the rest of his life whenever he tried to explain it to himself, which he never fully managed. His mouth opened before his mind caught up to why. She was saying his mother's language. Not fluently exactly, with the rough edges of someone who learned it late and kept it in a box for special occasions, but correctly, the vowels landing where Albanian vowels land, the rhythm his mother used to hum into his hair when he was small enough to still let her. Nobody had spoken that language directly to him in 11 years. Not since the funeral, not since he'd stood over a coffin in a suit that didn't fit yet, at 17, and understood that the only person who'd ever call him by his real name, his soft name, the one that wasn't Agron the enforcer, Agron who worked for Dritan Kara, Agron whose reputation was built out of silence, that person was gone, and the language had gone into a box with her. And here it was, in a diner, at 3 a.m., out of the mouth of an exhausted woman in a stained collared shirt who hadn't even noticed she was speaking it. It wasn't recognition. It was a door somebody had bricked over, coming open from the other side. Silence sat on the room like weather. Then the man beside him, younger, twitchier, the one whose job in situations like this was to be the muscle that actually moved, shifted his hand toward his jacket, because the older man they'd been sent to find had, in fact, just come out of the bathroom behind Odie's station. A heavy-set man in his 60s, who went white and reached slowly for the counter to steady himself. Odie didn't decide to step forward. Her body did it before the rest of her caught up, the way it had kept stirring the Byrek, the way 12 years teaches muscle to move faster than fear can veto it. She set down the spatula. She looked at the tall man, not at the gun, at him, and said, in his mother's language, the phrase Fatimja used to say to boys in that neighborhood who thought their fists solved more than their fists actually solved. Loosely, it meant, your mother is watching, and she is not proud, and shame does not wash off in the shower. It wasn't a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a woman his mother's age, more or less, invoking the one authority that had ever made him flinch, in the one voice he hadn't heard raised at him since he was a child too young to know what fear was for. The younger man's hand stopped on his jacket, waiting for a signal that wasn't coming, because the tall man, Agron, had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere 11 years back, standing in a kitchen 4 blocks from this one, 6 years old, skinned knee, his mother's hands on his face, saying the exact same words this stranger had just said, word for word, syllable for syllable, like she'd been handed the script. He didn't lower the gun because he'd never picked it back up. He simply turned, once, toward the door, and the other 3 men, reading something in his shoulders that none of them could have named, followed him out into a rain that had started up again while they were inside. The chime on the door rang. Nobody moved for 11 full seconds. Then Curtis, still holding his fork, said, "To no one, I'm gonna need a minute before I finish these eggs," and the diner exhaled all at once. The particular exhale of people who'd just watched something happen that they would never be able to explain correctly to anyone who hadn't been standing there. Gary disappeared into the office and didn't come out for 40 minutes. The older man in the bathroom doorway sat down hard on a stool and asked for water in a voice that shook. Priya finally moved her hand and immediately put the phone away, like it had burned her. Odie went back to her Byrek because it was going to burn if she didn't, and because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, the rain had stopped, and Newark smelled the way it smells after a heat breaks: wet concrete, cut grass from somebody's postage stamp yard, the particular ozone smell that hangs in the air for an hour after a storm moves east toward the water. Odie had told exactly no one the full version of what happened, partly because Gary had told her, in the office, in a voice with none of its usual weight, that she should forget she saw anything, and partly because there wasn't a version of the story that didn't sound insane out loud. She was 3 blocks from the bus stop, off shift, dead on her feet, when a car she didn't recognize, dark, low, absurdly clean for a city this dirty, pulled level with her on Ferry Street and idled. The window came down, cedar and rain, even though it wasn't raining. That was the first thing she noticed, before she noticed his face. A man's cologne, something old-fashioned, expensive without announcing it, and underneath it, faint gun oil, the smell of something cleaned often and handled rarely, a smell she associated, though she couldn't have said why yet, with a kind of danger that didn't need to raise its voice. "You," he said, not a question, just a fact he was confirming to himself. She kept walking. He idled alongside her, patient, which unsettled her more than urgency would have. "I'm not doing this," she said, without stopping. "Whatever this is, I have somewhere to be." "You don't," he said. "Your shift ended at 3. It's 3:20. You take the 34 bus, which comes in 9 minutes, so you have time to talk to me." She stopped then, because a stranger reciting her bus schedule back to her was a specific kind of alarming that made talking to him, briefly, the safer option than continuing to pretend he wasn't there. "You had someone follow me. I had someone find out who you were," he said. "That's different." "It isn't, really." The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, more the memory of the shape a smile makes, and was gone before it committed to anything. "Where did you learn to speak that?" he said. "The way you spoke it. A woman raised me for 6 years. She's dead now. Say her name." "Why would I do that?" "Because if I say it first," he said, "and I'm wrong, I've wasted both our time. And if I say it first and I'm right, you're going to want to know how I knew, and that's a longer conversation than we have before your bus." Odie studied him the way she studied a walk-in freezer that had started making a noise it shouldn't, with the specific wariness of someone assessing whether the thing in front of her was about to become a problem she couldn't afford. "Fatimja Krasnicki," she said finally. "She fostered kids on Elm for 20 years. Half the neighborhood came through her kitchen at some point." Something moved behind his eyes, fast, gone before she could read it fully. "She fostered me for 8 months," he said. "Before your time, before she got her license renewed properly, when she was doing it a little off the books, taking kids the system had already given up paperwork on. I was 7. The silence that followed had weight to it, the specific gravity of 2 strangers realizing they'd both been raised, at different hours of the same house, by the same tired woman, with the same folding technique for dough. "That's not," Odie started, then stopped, because there wasn't a sentence that finished that thought without sounding foolish. "I have a job for you," he said instead, businesslike now, the door that had opened already closing back to something professional. "Translation work, a few hours a week. I pay well. Better than that diner pays you in a month." "No, you haven't heard the number." "I don't need the number." Her bus was visible now, 2 blocks down, grinding toward its stop with the particular reluctance of city transit. "I know what kind of man drives a car like that and asks a stranger about her dead foster mother in the same conversation. I'm not licensed to do anything for you, whatever it is. I don't have a business tax ID. I don't have a lawyer, and if something goes wrong, I'm the one with no paperwork, and you're the one with a driver." "That's not a no about the work," he said. "That's a no about the risk. Same thing, from where I'm standing." "Not to me it isn't." He reached into his jacket, slow, deliberately slow, the way you move around something that's already decided you might be dangerous, and set a card on the dashboard shelf without offering it to her directly, like he already knew she wouldn't take it from his hand. "The offer doesn't expire. I don't ask twice as a rule. I'm making an exception because you knew her too." The bus hissed to a stop at the corner. Odie walked toward it without looking back, and didn't take the card, and told herself the whole 4-block walk that this was the end of it. It wasn't. Rent was due on the 1st. On the 29th, her landlord, a wiry man named Costas, who managed 4 buildings on that block, with the warmth of a parking meter, taped a notice to her door that used the words "commencement of proceedings," which was landlord for the beginning of the end of something. She had the number now. $340 had become $510 because Costas had added a late fee that existed nowhere in her lease and everywhere in his imagination, and Ref's dental abscess had gotten worse overnight, the vet said, in a voice careful with the specific gentleness reserved for people who are about to be told a number they can't pay. And the number this time was 600, and it needed to happen inside a week, or the infection would move somewhere it couldn't come back from. She stood in her kitchenette at midnight with the card he'd left. She had, in fact, taken it 3 seconds before the bus pulled away, some animal instinct overriding the version of herself that had just said no, turning it over in her fingers. No name on it, just a phone number and, beneath it, in small type, a single word in Albanian that meant, roughly, debt, or maybe obligation, depending on which of Fatimja's translations you trusted, and Odie had never fully trusted either. She thought about the word besa, which Fatimja used constantly, and which didn't translate cleanly into English, no matter how many times Odie had tried, something like a sworn word, a promise so binding that breaking it cost you more than money ever could. She thought about how the man in the car had used that word without saying it, just by leaving a debt on a piece of cardstock and driving away before she could hand it back. Ref put his head on her foot and sighed the specific sigh of a dog whose owner has been standing still for too long without feeding him. She called the number at 12:40 in the morning, and a voice that wasn't his answered on the second ring, unbothered by the hour, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of operation answered its phones at 12:40 in the morning. "I'll do the translation work," she said. "Not the other thing, whatever the other thing is." "There's only ever one thing," the voice said, and it wasn't Agron's voice, but it had learned its patience from somewhere adjacent to his. "He'll be in touch." He was in touch by 9 the next morning, a text with an address and a time, no pleasantries, and when she showed up, an office over the shipping company, cedar polish, that same ghost of acetone in the floorboards she'd notice later and never ask about. He was waiting with an envelope that had $600 in it before she'd said a single word. "That's not payment," he said, seeing her face. "That's an advance. Payment comes after the job. I didn't ask for an advance." "I know," he said. "Take it anyway. Your dog's surgery is Thursday. I looked into the number." She should have found that terrifying. Somewhere underneath the exhaustion, she supposed she did. But $600 sitting in an envelope in front of a man who already knew her dog's name felt less like a threat in that moment and more like the first thing that had gone right in a month. And Odie Marsh had learned a long time ago not to interrogate good luck too closely, because good luck tended to leave if you stared at it too hard. She took the envelope. She didn't say thank you, because something in her understood, without being told, that thank you was the wrong currency for this particular transaction. It implied a debt could close, and she suspected, correctly, that it couldn't. She set 3 conditions before she'd fold the envelope into her bag, and she set them the way she'd set terms with every difficult customer she'd ever worked a counter for. Flatly, without apology, because apologizing for a boundary was the fastest way to lose it. "Cash on the books as a contractor, or I don't touch it," she said. "I'm not going near anything I can't explain to a tax office if it comes to that. I need a real number on a real form, even if the form doesn't say what the room actually was." "Done," Agron said, like it cost him nothing, which she understood, even then, meant it cost him something he simply didn't show. "No weapons visible when I'm at a table. I don't care what's in a jacket. I don't want to see it." "That's harder," he said. "But done. For you specifically. And if I say a job is finished, it's finished. I'm not on a retainer. I'm not yours." He looked at her for a long moment at that last one, the way a man looks at a door he'd assumed was already open and has just been told, politely, is not. "Understood," he said. and something in his voice suggested he understood it more literally than she'd meant it. Filing the sentence away, the way she'd noticed he filed everything. For later, for leverage, or maybe just for the simple discipline of not forgetting a single thing a person told him about themselves. Dritan Kara wanted to see her before the second job. He didn't ask. Agron simply told her there'd be a car Wednesday and that the car went to a restaurant on Bloomfield Avenue that didn't have a menu posted in the window, which she'd learn later meant the same thing it meant about the bar with no sign. Dritan Kara turned out to be smaller than she expected, compact and grey at the temples, dressed like an accountant, which she supposed, in the specific arithmetic of his business, he essentially was. He didn't stand when she sat. He looked at her the unhurried way a man looks at a used car he's already decided to buy and is now simply pricing. "For Timja's girl," he said, which told her Agron had briefed him thoroughly, and unsettled her more than a threat would have, because a threat she knew how to answer. "I knew her. She fed half this neighborhood on a foster stipend that wouldn't cover the electric bill. Formidable woman." "She was. Agron tells me you caught something in a room full of men who count money for a living, and none of them caught it first." He turned a glass of water in slow circles on the table, without drinking from it. "I don't hire people because I like them. I hire people because they're useful, and because usefulness, unlike liking, doesn't wear off. Are you going to be useful to me, Miss Marsh?" "I'm going to translate accurately," she said. "That's the whole of what I signed up for. I'm not interested in being anything else to your organization." "Nobody starts out interested," Dritan said, not unkindly, and the way he said it, like a man reciting a fact he'd watched prove true too many times to argue with, sat in her chest the rest of that afternoon like a stone she hadn't asked to swallow. The job, that first week, was small. A meeting with a shipping contact from Durrus who spoke almost no English, 3 hours of translating logistics that meant nothing to her. Container numbers, customs codes, the mundane skeleton of a business that everyone in the room politely pretended was entirely legal. She did it well. She was precise, and she didn't editorialize. And when the man from Durrus made a joke at Agron's expense in rapid dialect, assuming the woman at the table couldn't follow it, she translated it faithfully, instead of softening it, which made Agron's mouth do the almost smile thing again, the one that never fully arrived. "You could have changed that," he said afterward, in the elevator, the two of them and nobody else. "You'd have known I did. Most people don't think that far ahead. Most people haven't spent 6 years getting yelled at in 2 languages at once," she said. "You learn to hear both versions." He looked at her for a long moment in the elevator's bad fluorescent light, the kind of light that makes everyone look a little sick and a little more honest for it. "The second job's bigger," he said. "You should say no to it. I want you to know that going in. I'm not going to talk you into it." "Then why offer it to me?" "Because you're the only person I trust in that room who isn't already mine," he said. And the word mine landed strange in the small space, and neither of them commented on it. The warehouse smelled like standing water and diesel, and, underneath both, the specific mineral smell of rust that had been rained on and dried 100 times over. 12 folding chairs. 2 long tables pushed end to end and covered in a cloth someone had bothered to iron, which struck Odie, walking in, as the strangest detail of the whole night. Men who settled disputes with car rides and offhand sentences had still cared enough to iron a tablecloth. Agron sat her at his left before the Bardi crew arrived, and told her, once, quietly, the only instruction he gave her all night. "Translate exactly. Don't smooth anything, even if it sounds ugly in English. Ugly is information." The second job was a meeting between Dritan Kara's people and the Bardi crew from Elizabeth, the same crew whose men had walked into Sal's all night 3 weeks earlier, looking for a man to make disappear. A negotiation, Agron called it, over territory, and a debt neither side agreed on the size of. Odie sat at Agron's left, in a warehouse that smelled like machine grease and the particular mildew of a building near water, and translated numbers back and forth across a table where at least 4 of the 12 people present were, she was fairly sure, armed. 2 hours in, a Bardi lieutenant made an offer that didn't add up. Odie caught it before anyone else in the room did. A discrepancy of $11,000, buried inside a sentence, designed to slide past a translator who was only listening for vocabulary and not arithmetic. She didn't announce it. She turned to Agron and said, quietly, in English, "He's short you by 11,000, and he thinks you won't check." The room went still, in the particular way rooms go still, when something has shifted, and only some of the people present know what. Agron didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Say the number again," he said to the Bardhi man, in Albanian, and watched the man's face when the correction came, and watched, more specifically, a younger member of his own crew, a man named Bess, 23, who'd been with Dritton's operation 8 months, flinch at a number he had no obvious reason to have already known. The traitor wasn't in the room across the table. He was at Agron's own table, 3 seats down. Nobody said anything for 11 seconds. Odie would count them later, the same 11 seconds from the diner, apparently her body's unit of measurement for silences that mattered. "Bess," Agron said, conversationally, "the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt, you'll ride back with Dritton's driver tonight, instead of with us." That was all. No shout, no gun on the table this time. Just a sentence delivered in the tone of a scheduling change, and Bess's face going the color of the eggs Curtis never got to finish that first night, and 2 men near the door shifting their weight in a way that told Odie, with total clarity, that Bess would not be attending any meetings after this one, and that the scheduling change Agron had just described so mildly was, in fact, the entire consequence, spoken all at once, in a single sentence, offhand. She didn't ask what happened to Bess. Some part of her understood that asking would be the one question in this new arrangement she genuinely didn't want answered, and she filed that understanding away next to the envelope of cash and the dog's surgery and the rent that was, for the first time in 14 months, going to be paid on time. The negotiation finished 40 minutes later, on terms that favored Dritton's side, by a margin Odie suspected had everything to do with the arithmetic she'd caught. Outside, in the parking lot, one of the Bardhi lieutenants, the same man whose number she'd corrected, fell into step beside her for 4 strides, close enough that she smelled the wintergreen gum he was chewing over something sourer underneath it. Cigarettes, maybe, or fear, the two often smelling similar on a man trying to appear unbothered. "You want to be careful how sharp your ears are," he said, quiet, almost friendly, which made it worse. "Sharp ears make a woman memorable. Memorable isn't always a compliment in this business." "Noted," she said, and kept walking, and didn't let the tremor that had started in her hands reach her voice, because showing him the tremor would have been handing him the exact currency he'd come over to collect. Agron was beside her, before the man finished his sentence. Not quite between them, but close enough that the message required no translation in either direction. The lieutenant smiled thinly, said something about the rain, and peeled off toward a different car. "That happened a lot?" she asked once they were moving. "People telling me to be careful how good I am at my job." "It'll happen more," Agron said. "That's the part of this I should have told you before tonight, instead of after." He didn't apologize for it exactly, but something in the flat certainty of his voice carried the weight of an apology anyway. "You made yourself visible in that room. Visible is a currency too. It buys you respect, and it buys you a target, usually in the same transaction, and I don't get to choose which one lands first." "Is that a warning?" "It's an inventory," he said, echoing, without knowing it, the exact word she'd use for what he told her later that night at the bar. "I don't do warnings. I do information, so you can decide what you want to do with it." She thought about Costas on the stairwell, about the $600 already gone into Ref's surgery, about rent finally paid on the first, for the first time in 14 months, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes at the end of a very long day, that she'd already decided, days ago, probably the moment she dialed that number at 12:40 in the morning, and that the lieutenant's warning, however real, was arriving too late to change anything. Agron drove her home himself, which she hadn't expected, in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as it was heavy with things neither of them had decided yet whether to say. "You didn't have to catch that," he said, 3 blocks from her building. I didn't have to do a lot of things tonight. Why did you? She thought about it honestly before she answered, because he seemed like a man who noticed the difference between an honest answer and a fast one. Because Fatimja used to say the worst thing in the world is being taken for a fool by somebody who thinks you're too tired to notice, she said. I've had that year. I wasn't going to sit at a table and watch somebody else have it. He pulled up outside her building and didn't turn off the engine and didn't look at her directly, which she was beginning to understand was how he handled anything that came close to the shape of feeling. There's a bar 4 blocks from here, he said. Not the kind with a name on the awning. I go there when a night like tonight needs somewhere quiet to end instead of just stopping. That's not really an invitation, she said. It's a location. I know, he said. I'm not good at the other kind. She should have gone inside. She had every practical reason to go inside. An early shift, a dog waiting on antibiotics, a version of her life that had, until 3 weeks ago, never once intersected with rooms where $11,000 discrepancies got settled with a single sentence about a car ride. She got back in when he pulled the door open from inside, instead of waiting for her to decide, which she noted, privately, was its own kind of answer. The bar had no sign, the way he'd said, and smelled like bourbon that had soaked into the wood of the bar top over 40 years, and a candle somebody lit for atmosphere and then forgot to blow out early enough. Agron ordered without asking her what she wanted, and got it right anyway, something with rye in it, not too sweet, which she chose not to be unsettled by, mostly because she was too tired to be unsettled by one more thing that night. They sat at the end of the bar, away from the 2 other patrons, and for a long time neither of them said anything, which she found she didn't mind. There was a particular kind of quiet that came from 2 people who'd both spent the evening performing calm they didn't fully feel, and this was that kind. "Show me your hand," he said eventually. "Why? You cut it, loading the boxes earlier. You've been favoring it since the warehouse." She hadn't noticed she was favoring anything. She held out her hand, a shallow cut across 2 knuckles, the kind of thing a line cook collected constantly and stopped registering, and he took it in both of his, gently, in a way that felt entirely at odds with the sentence he'd delivered about Bess an hour earlier, and pressed a cold glass against the knuckles to bring the swelling down, his thumb resting against her wrist the whole time, feeling, she understood suddenly, for her pulse, the way you'd check on someone you were worried, had been more frightened tonight than they'd let on. Her pulse, predictably, chose that exact moment to become something she couldn't have hidden if she'd tried. "You're not as unaffected as you're pretending," he said quietly, still holding her hand. "Neither are you. You've been not looking at me for a week." That almost smile again, closer to arriving this time than it had ever gotten. My mother used to say, I inherited my father's face and nobody's manners. Fatimja said something similar about half the kids who came through her kitchen. Did she say it about you? She said I had the manners and none of the sense God gave a chicken, Odie said, and for the first time since the diner, something in his shoulders actually loosened. A real laugh, short and low, the kind a man produces from somewhere he'd forgotten he still had. "We're from the same dirt," he said, after the laugh faded, serious again. "Different kitchen, same woman standing in it. I don't know what to do with that. Neither do I." "My father left when I was 4, he said, looking at the bourbon soaking into the wood, instead of at her, the way a man talks when he's decided to say something true and needs somewhere else to put his eyes while he says it. My mother cleaned 3 houses a day to keep us fed, and I don't remember her ever once sitting down before 10 at night. She died at 41. Her heart, the doctor said, though I think it was just the arithmetic of the thing, working out how many years a body gets charged for that kind of tired. Fatimja worked 2 jobs the whole time I lived with her, Odie said. She used to say the state paid her enough for 1 kid and she always had 4, so the math never worked, and she did it anyway, every year, because somebody had to and nobody else was volunteering. That's the part outsiders don't understand about people like us, he said. They think the danger is the interesting part. The interesting part was always just this: women who worked themselves to the bone quietly, and nobody wrote a single word about it, and their kids grew up either terrified of ending up that tired or determined never to look that tired in public again, whatever it cost them to hide it. "Which one are you?" "Both," he said, "on alternating days." She turned her glass in a slow circle on the bar, an unconscious echo of the gesture she'd watched Drayton Kara make with his water glass 2 days earlier, and didn't notice she was doing it. "I used to think if I just worked hard enough," she said, "eventually the hard part would run out. Like there was a finish line somewhere past the rent, and past the dog's teeth, and past whatever came after that, and I'd get there, and it would just stop being this hard. I don't believe that anymore. I think it's just going to keep costing something, every year, a little different each time, and the only choice is what you're willing to let it cost." "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in this bar in 4 years, Agron said, and there was nothing performative in it, no line delivered for effect, just a tired man agreeing with a tired woman about the shape of the only life either of them had ever actually had. "I'm not a safe thing to want," he said. It wasn't a warning. It was worse than a warning. It was an honest inventory, delivered the way he delivered everything, flatly, without performance. "I didn't ask if you were safe," she said. "I asked what we're supposed to do with the same dirt." He didn't answer that. Instead, he turned her hand over, slowly, and pressed his mouth, briefly, to the 2 cut knuckles, a gesture so unlike the man who'd just rearranged another man's future, with a single sentence about a car ride, that Odie felt the floor of the bar tilt very slightly under her, though nothing in the room had actually moved. Neither of them took it further than that. It wasn't caution exactly. It was the specific patience of 2 people who both understood, without saying it, that whatever this was had already crossed a line neither of them could walk back from, and that some things are better left to arrive slowly, on their own schedule, the way rent comes due, the way infection spreads if you don't treat it in time, the way a debt written on a business card, in a language only 2 people at that bar could read, sits quietly, accruing, until the night it's finally called in. He drove her home a second time. This time he walked her to the door, which he hadn't done the first time, and stood on the step a beat too long, and she understood, watching him not quite leave, that whatever came next, the rent paid on time, the dog healed, Bez gone from whatever car he'd been put in, none of it was going to be simple again, and some tired, stubborn, 12 years on a line part of her had already decided that simple hadn't been serving her especially well anyway. "Same time Thursday," he said, which was, for a man like him, apparently as close as he got to asking if he could see her again. "I've got a double Thursday," she said. "Dinah doesn't know about any of this." "I'm aware. Don't forget," she added, already turning her key in the lock. Deadpan, dry, the exact tone she used on drunks who tried to order the meatloaf special after 10. "The special today's meatloaf. You seem like a meatloaf man." He stood there a second longer than the joke earned, like he was recalibrating something, and then, for the first time since she'd known him, Agron Nikaj actually smiled. Not the almost smile, the whole thing, before the door closed between them and the hallway light buzzed on above her, indifferent to everything that had just happened underneath it. Odie Marsh went to bed that night with $600 already spent on a dog's surgery, rent covered for the first time in over a year, a cut on her knuckles that had been kissed by a man half the city was afraid to look at directly, and no idea, none at all, what Thursday, or the debt on that business card, or the word Besa was actually going to cost her before this was over. She fell asleep anyway. Some things, she'd learned a long time ago, you can only face rested. That's where we'll leave Odie and Agron tonight. A diner cook who spoke a dead woman's language into a room full of guns, and the enforcer who hadn't heard his mother's voice in 11 years until a stranger handed it back to him at 3 a.m. Whether that debt on the business card ever gets called in, and whether the same dirt is enough to keep 2 people like this out of the ground, is something neither of them knows yet either. What do you think happens to Odie once Drayton Kara finds out exactly how she caught that $11,000? Drop your prediction in the comments. I read every one of them. If this one kept you up past your own 3 a.m., like the video, share it with somebody who'd appreciate it, and subscribe with the bell on for the next chapter.